My name is Andrew. This is the final paper from my French Revolution class in college. I titled it The Effects of the French Revolution on Quebec. So during the 17th century, France colonized Canada. A wave of French immigration started with the founding of Quebec City in 1608 and continued up until the annexation of Quebec by Great Britain in 1763. Although immigration ended before the start of the French Revolution, the people of Quebec still felt really close ties with the people back home. As the French Revolution ensued in the motherland, the Quebecois still felt very inspired by the revolutionaries. Drawing upon their French heritage and Britain's attempts to prevent the spread of the French Revolution in Quebec, the Canadians were influenced by this revolutionary movement, which contributed to Quebec's struggle for freedom and perpetuated the problems faced by the Quebecois. To understand the impact of the revolution on Quebec, it is necessary to understand the state of the region at the time and the people who lived there. The area was under French rule until their loss to the French in the French and Indian War, which forced their land over to the British. The many French who populated Quebec during the 155 years of colonization would usually not like the British to take over, and they didn't. They were sworn enemies for hundreds and hundreds of years, and have them take over your land, you wouldn't like that either. But the new leaders of Quebec did all they could to make sure life in Quebec was not too different. They did not want a French uprising to occur. After the conquest, British authorities accepted that the Ancien regime, which is the old regime of France, the old royalist regime, and their ways of life, like the seigneurial system of property, as shown here, with farmers contributing their crops and their money to their seigneurial lord. The conquest did not modify that organization of work, basic institutions, or social relations. But what it did do was substitute a British for a French metropolitan majority elite. This shows that the British were very smart about not touching the lives of average Canadians. Who held the power was the only thing that changed. By law, the elite who originally involved themselves into politics could not run. British law stated that you had to be Protestant in order to run for office. So by extension, the French Canadians, who were very Catholic, could neither hold government positions nor sit in an assembly in the colony. It forced the aristocratic French to turn back to the soil and to continue to farm for the British. The Quebecois had successfully been controlled without much change. But during the start of the Revolution, the Canadians took a close watch. Even under a new crown, the Quebecois kept intimate links with their cousins back in France and understood the struggles that they were facing. After the eruption of what would become the French Revolution in 1789, a historian described how Canadians would assemble in the towns in small groups and tell each other the latest news that they received. They rejoiced when the news was favorable to the French and grieved when it was unfavorable. During the colonization of Quebec, about a third of the immigrants came from the Vendée and surrounding departments in France. The people in this region were very strongly religious and very strongly Catholic. During the French Revolution, peasants and rural artisans focused their anger on administrators in the towns because officials had arrested and deported their priests. But rural people wanted local nobles to help them restore their priests and the monarchy. And these people were the direct cousins of the people that were colonizing in Quebec. They only wanted their church. That's what they needed the most. Canadians were considered one of the most devout people in the world at the time. The church had controls of all facets of early Quebec society, from the Jesuits owning a quarter of the seigneuries along the St. Lawrence River, to the strong Catholic influence on pre-British legislation. In France, the church was at the first estate and at the highest social status, even before the nobles. But at the start of the French Revolution, the French in Quebec supported these revolutionaries. The early revolutionary leaders understood that there was flaws within the system, but they never wanted to get rid of their beloved king or the church. They just wanted reform. The Quebecois shared this belief. Canadians hoped that the French people would remake their nation in the world in the image of liberty, like the Americans did just south of them. They did not support the radical reforms of the latter part of the revolution, though. The church, through its teachings of obedience, prevented the Quebecois from backing this heretical revolution, as the church called it. Their dominance over the Canadian people led to the British taking advantage of the church's power to further subjugate the French. The religious culture of Quebec is what leads to their downfall and their subservience to the British. When England found out about the ousting of King Louis in France, they became worried about their new French-speaking colony in Canada. They thought that in the event of an invasion or an uprising, the Canadians would rise en masse in support, and English heads would be the target of Jacobin pikes. Britain thought it would be, it might experience rebellion, and took measures to prevent its Canadian subjects from breaking free from its control. The British government made an effort to prevent any sort of influence from revolutionary France to be received by the Quebecois. A large act of prevention initiated by the Brits was formally known as the Clergy Endowments Act. This split the English people in Upper Canada, now known as Ontario, from the French people in Lower Canada, now known as Quebec. French people became more able to participate in the government this way because they were allowed to have a majority Quebecois lower assembly, and finally allowed Catholics to serve in Congress. So when the French Revolution started, the British rushed to enact the Clergy Endowment Acts to maintain some sort of French loyalty to them. London granted an elected assembly because of the word that the Canadians would be aroused by the French Revolution. The split, though, was not accepted by all the Quebecois. Many liberals of the time feared that the French common law that remained in Canada further divided the rich from the poor and the seigneurs from the small Canadian farmers. This was the same exact problem that started the French Revolution. Pamphlets around Quebec called for change using vocabulary containing words such as citizens, general will, natural rights, and equality, all words that were used in major documents during the French Revolution. There's no doubt why the British would be upset by this. They predicted that this would happen and already attempted to prevent it constitutionally, and the Canadians still protested. Even members of the lower house in Canada privately supported the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, which is the most important document in the history of the French Revolution. It came to a point where the British rulers saw them as dangerous and infected by the revolutionary principles prevalent in France. So, Britain started to restrict the press. Since it took 2.5 months for news to come from the Old World to Quebec or the United States, they received the same news from either Paris or London, and it was pretty easy to stop certain news from coming over. By the middle of the decade, Canadians accessed a relentlessly anti-revolutionary stream of news, while Americans could pick and choose from a wider variety of news sources. They could go straight from the source in Paris, or they could go to London. The Quebecois only were able to get their news from London. A man from London instructed a guy from Boston to rely very little on the London paper for the accounts of French affairs, for they are throughout inaccurate, confused, and in general, shamefully partial and malignant. Montreal's many French residents no doubt shuddered to read about the victims crying aloud to heaven for a counter-revolution, and as the bloodthirsty, terrible revolutionaries killed all before them. This was the rhetoric that was being pushed to them by the British. The Attorney General of Lower Canada at the time identified openly as anti-French, and he was appointed directly by the king. He pushed for the legislature to legalize the spread of fake news, which effectively meant pro-French news. The last influence came from the principal institution in the lives of Canadians, the Catholic Church. The overwhelming majority of the Canadian clergy became fearful of the revolution because of its secular reforms and the elimination of the Catholic Church from political power. They also opposed the violence that ensued because of the revolution. Britain took advantage and persuaded the Catholic clergy to evangelize about the horrors of the revolution and the dangers of false information. By late 1794, the Bishop of Quebec issued a circular letter to the priests of Canada, asking them to challenge the spread of rumors about revolutionary France. He instructed Canadian priests to inform their parishioners that revolutionary France was in a state of anarchy and irreligion, and suggested that they publish this information and read it aloud from the pulpit as many times as necessary until they get the point. It is important to note that the governor of Canada appointed the Bishop of Quebec. The bishop followed orders made by the governor, who always happened to be British. By 1796, very few Canadians dared to publicly support revolutionary France. The bishop did so well at ending any sort of opposition to the British government that he got a seat in Parliament. But these British attempts to find a solution to the problems of governing the Quebecois led them to create even more problems. It was just a piece of tape. It's very easy to rip off, and once it rips off, it causes even more problems. Actions the British government took to quell a possible uprising backfired over time, resulting in a resentment of the government. Even after the separation of Upper and Lower Canada, the Quebecois still held less power in their province compared to their English counterparts. The first problem following the creation of Lower Canada arose from the election of a speaker. The French members, being the majority, proposed a Frenchman, but the English minority, which held about 15%, proposed an Englishman. So when it went up to the upper house, or the nobles, they chose the Englishman. Ultimately, even as the minority, the Englishman received the speaker's seat. The French-Canadian members of the new Legislative Assembly of Lower Canada had awakened to the fact that they were not enjoying the position or power that their counterparts in England in the House of Commons were receiving. In the first place, the measures that were being passed were continually thrown out by the upper chamber, and they were powerless to prevent it. In second place, they had no control of the government at all. Anything they tried to do was struck down by the English. For the governor and his executive council were appointed by and responsible to the colonial office alone, which was always British. They constituted a local oligarchy known as the Chateau clique. And this Chateau clique was very important in Quebec history because they were the ones that were creating these actual laws and continuing to subjugate the French. It meant that an almost unanimously British upper house would almost always support the small amount of British elected officials in the lower house. The French made up almost 90% of the population of Quebec, but were unable to truly participate in their own government. The appearance of Canadians in the lower house masked the continuation of English dominance in Quebec. Since the end of the French Revolution, the British politicians sought even more power than they gave up to prevent Quebecois rebellion. The new governor, James Craig, supported the idea of a more English Canada. He had prejudices against the inhabitants and their doubts about their loyalty. This is something he said time and time again in his letters. He started his term by encouraging immigration from Britain and the United States to finally make the Quebecois the minority. In Canada, he surrounded himself with such men who were actually in favor of repressing the Quebecois and crushing their power in their church. The province must be converted into an English colony, declared one of his men, or it will ultimately be lost to England. This proves the true opinions and true intentions of English politicians. It seems as though they're afraid of a revolution, but at this point, they hope to prevent it with force rather than through appeasement like they did during the Revolution. That change in belief is what leads to the governing of Canada by James Craig being named the Reign of Terror. Nowhere as brutal as the Reign of Terror in France, of course, but Sir Craig threw anyone in prison suspected to be anti-government or anti-royalist. Quebec City newspaper, Le Canadien, complained in Craig's dictionary, a bad fellow, an anti-ministerialist, a Democrat, a sans-culotte, and a Canadian all mean the same thing. That newspaper only lasted 3 years until the government arrested all of the founders and threw them in jail. The culmination of no true representation, continued restrictions of the press, and rising tensions between the French and English-speaking Canadians brought the Quebecois to elect a new Parti Canadien. The son of a politician and lawyer, Louis-Joseph Papineau, is elected during the founding of the Parti Canadien. At first, the party was fairly moderate. The Canadians supported the government and only sought more representation. But what seems to have first angered the Parti Canadien came from the proposal to unite Upper and Lower Canada in 1822. Financial difficulties had arisen between the two provinces for years, and the Canadian government preyed on this fact to introduce a union bill to the House of Commons in England, worded in terms very unfavorable to the French. There's little doubt that the actual point of the bill was for the extinction of the Lower Canada Assembly and the subordination of the French to the English element of the colony. The French Canadians saw the bill as a menace to their national existence. Luckily, the bill did not pass because Papineau, along with his team, went over directly to England to stop it. After this very close call, the restriction of French rights became more and more apparent. By 1832, Papineau's political views took a more revolutionary turn. Our Constitution, he said, has been manufactured by a Tory influenced by the terrors of the French Revolution. He had lost faith in the justice of the British government and its willingness to redress grievances. His party changes from the Parti Canadien at that point to the Parti Patriot. The Parti Patriot, fed up with the government failing to change, presented the 92 resolutions. The resolutions constituted the political platform of the extreme wing of the Parti Patriot and are compared to a sort of declaration of rights, like the ones in France. Among other grievances, Lower Canadians asked for frequent and fair elections, the elimination of the aristocracy, and freedom of speech and press. All things that were said in both the Declaration of Independence and also in the Declarations of the Rights of Man and Citizen. This resolution passed the lower house and shipped past the upper house directly to London, to the House of Commons. While the Patriots waited patiently for a response, many of the moderate leaders were voted out in favor for more radical representatives in Parliament. The ideological switch by the Quebecois shows that they became increasingly resentful of the government. Resentment grew as 3 years went by until the House of Commons finally responded to the 92 resolutions. They listed 10 resolutions, now known as the Russell Resolutions, which viewed the 92 resolutions very negatively. In fact, the Russell Resolutions rejected all 92 of their demands. The rejection led many Canadians to gather in large groups, just like this one, to hear very many Patriot politicians speak. The largest and most important meeting, held on October 23rd at St. Charles-sur-Richelieu, had 5,000 or 6,000 people attended. This is the painting. Louis-Joseph Papineau, who's seen here, held a meeting and spoke out against the neglect of the British government on the Quebecois and the continued discrimination they faced. He knew that many of his followers wanted violence, but he spoke out against any sort of rebellion. The crowd features many wearing red Phrygian caps, as seen here, and also in the pole back there. These caps were known as the Bonnet Rouge in France and were seen during the French Revolution as the symbol for liberty. So they were borrowing a lot of terms, a lot of garments from the French Revolution because of their close ties to the French. A month later, a skirmish took place between a small party of British troopers and a band of patriots on the road between Chambly and Longueuil. A skirmish that started the inevitable Lower Canada Rebellion. The rebellion quickly gained momentum and spread across various regions of Lower Canada, reflecting how widespread the Patriot influence actually was among the French-speaking population. At the start, the Patriots experienced some successes in their resistance efforts. They effectively controlled several towns and engaged in clashes with British forces. Despite these early victories, the Patriots struggled to maintain a coordinated and unified front. The lack of central leadership and clear strategy hindered their ability to sustain their momentum. The British response to the rebellion was forceful. Several significant events and battles took place during this period, including the Battle of Saint-Denis, the Battle of Saint-Charles, and the Battle of Saint-Eustache. These engagements were marked by intense fighting and resulted in numerous casualties on both sides. The British utilized their superior might and firepower and resources to gradually regain control of the territories held by the Patriots. The British forces implemented a strategy of dividing and isolating rebel strongholds, cutting off supply lines, and gradually retaking key positions. The rebellion was ultimately suppressed within a year. Following their defeat, many Patriot leaders faced dire consequences. Some were sent to Australia, some were kicked out to the United States, others were arrested and imprisoned. The British government imposed a period of repression, with martial law declared, civil liberties suspended, and the unification of Upper and Lower Canada. This period of repression further strained the relationship between the French-speaking population and the British colonial authorities. Along with economic reasons, this is what brought people here. Because the next 20 years, that's when the French started colonizing our area. This is a picture of Louis-Joseph Papineau, the famed politician. You may know Papineau, Illinois. That is named after him. Because many people that settled our area were from the most devout areas of Patriot support in Canada. Also, it explains why Chiniki was the way he was. He saw that the Bishop of Quebec was a corrupt man, along with all the other clergy. And he knew from his dedication to the Bible that the church should not be like that. Which is why he fought back against the Catholic Church in the first place. And that's it. This was me when I was 11. This is actually my last day at this museum. So I've been here since I was 8. So it's been 11 years now. So I'm kind of wearing the same exact thing. There's the same exact pulpit, there's the same exact chairs and everything. So, with that I say, merci.